Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final session of this afternoon, Emerging Markets, Understanding the Chinese Carbon Market Proposal. I'm Jackson Ewing. I'm with the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. I'm a relatively new addition to the Institute, and I come most recently from the Asia Society Policy Institute, where for the past several years I've been working on issues relating to carbon market development and maturation in Northeast Asia, China, of course, looming large in that picture. China is making a big bet on carbon markets and carbon pricing broadly. Over the past several years, they have experimented with multiple different market designs across some of their largest industrial and urban zones. And through these piloted systems, have learned a number of lessons that they have recently fed into the creation of a national ETS. As this national ETS continues to grow and become more robust and more impactful, it will ultimately become the largest ETS in the world and have ripple effects internationally and certainly throughout the different sectors that it will eventually cover in China. With that said, though, there are a number of unanswered questions and several challenging arguments about the position that China finds itself in its early days of this nascent national scheme. And that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'm really, really delighted to have such an able panel for doing so. To my immediate left, we have Lulu Zhao from the EDF China. I've had the privilege of being on similar daises with Lulu in the past, and I can say she's particularly well equipped to tell us the kind of up-to-date intelligence about what's going on in China on the market developments as we speak and what we might expect in the years to come. To Lulu's left, we have Craig Hart, who has dual appointments at the Atlantic Council and at Johns Hopkins. He's spent roughly the last 5 years in China and has a team of people that are working to map out different aspects of the Chinese policy space, and has recently offered some provocations, we'll say, about the Chinese market and presenting some really important questions about how it can become more effective and what we might expect moving ahead. To Craig's left, we have Fan Dai, who is coming from Governor Brown's office and has just taken the train down to join us for this particular panel, so we're particularly appreciative of that. Of course, Fan has a unique perspective on the Chinese market as she gazes across the Pacific at it, given the sorts of connectivity that we've seen between China and California on many issues in the environmental policy space, emissions trading among them. So we're going to ask her to share some of her insights on the view from California. But to get started, I want to hear from Lulu. Lulu, what's going on with the Chinese market?
That's quite a complicated question. I'm trying to figure out for quite a while. As you might know, China started to thinking about using carbon market as a way to reduce carbon emission back in 2011, starting from 7 pilots. So after a couple of years, actually in the June of 2013, between June of 2013 and June of 2014, 7 pilots launched in different regions and basically cover about more than 20 sectors, about 3,000 enterprises. The trading volume is not that bad, and trading value is okay. And also, the government sees some results out of it. For example, one of the carbon pilots called Hubei is one of the only provinces located midwest of China. And it's still experiencing very high rate of development, like 9% of GDP growth per year, but it indeed achieved 3.5% reduction. So all of that gives China carbon market or the government more confident to start a national market. So last year, as Jackson said, on December 19th, the government organized or hosted a press conference to launch or kick off the entire effort to have a national market. I mean, you might have heard, although it's a national market, but it covers only power sector at the beginning, which represents about 3.5 billion CO2 equivalent per year, which makes it the largest carbon market in the world. And the threshold to include it's 26,000 CO2 equivalent tons per year emission. But that's the first phase. And what happened that day is 2 things happened. One is the government published a working plan to build a national carbon market that's publicly available, but only in Chinese. And the other one is 9 provinces and cities sign an agreement to build national carbon registry and national carbon trading platform. And also this working plan actually give a timeline for the following works. For example, the first phase lasts about a year. It's called foundation or infrastructure building phase. 4 major systems will be built. One is the direct emission reporting system, one is carbon registry, one is trading platform, and the other is the clearing system. And the other focus of the first year will be capacity building. And then all of the supporting measurement and goals will be drafted in this year. The second phase is called test run phase, lasts about also a year, which means all of the power sector will participate in some test run, not only to help them understand the entire system, but also to test the existing 4 systems, how they're working, whether they're working effectively and efficiently. Another thing is the Chinese government trying to build a risk management and risk warning system in the second phase. And the third phase is called expansion or improvement phase. Basically, it means the spot trading for power generation sector will happen in this phase. And if everything goes right, the government is considering to include more derivatives like future, maybe offset, and maybe to cover more sectors. Like, although power generation sector is the only sector we're talking about, but all of the 8 sectors that identified as the key sectors are doing all of the MRV work since 2015. So all of the data are collected from 2013 to 2017 right now. So the government is trying to include as much sector as they can as soon as possible. What else?
It wasn't a very big question. I mean.
Yes, one thing I want to talk about is the government transaction. As you might heard, China just had this huge governmental meetings, and many things changed. One thing is the government reorganization. The climate change issue was managed by the National Development and Reform Commission, but right now it's changed back to the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Right now it's called Ministry of Ecological Environment. So that's good and bad. But I definitely, from my perspective, I really welcome this change because this actually strengthened the integration of climate change issue and environmental protection issue. And also Ministry of Environmental Protection, or this new minister, MEE, has more teeth. They have capacity to inspect. They have inspector on the ground. They have enforcement on the ground. They have very strong team to do this work. But then they don't understand climate change issues. So there's this long process to train them from the beginning. But I mean, sharpen your axe doesn't mean you will slow down the process to chop the wood.
So I want to react to one thing and then ask you a follow-up question here, Lulu. The reaction is I really appreciate how you describe the creation of the market as this first step along which more expansion is going to build. Because many watchers of the Chinese ETS space were kind of disappointed with some aspects of the launch in December along the lines of, well, they initially said that it would cover 7 to 8 sectors. That was pared down to 4 sectors. Now we're launching with only 1 sector, and there are some difficulties that arise from not being able to trade across different sectors and find new efficiencies as a result of that. Others were saying, well, the compliance obligations are not going to really take on the teeth that we would like to see them have for a couple more years. There isn't any room for derivatives or futures or third-party financial players. But I think, because my reading on this is very similar to yours, that you rightly point out that all of these things are still baked into the system, and that the plan as it is available, and it is available through translation for those of us who can't read the Mandarin, does refer to those sorts of future steps. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The question I want to ask is about sharpening the axe and this transition from the NDRC to the MEE for all of China's climate policy, not just the ETS. Do you see substantial personnel movements from the NDRC over to the MEE that will lend some coherence to this process? How do you think that's going to play out?
I'm not in the government, so I cannot represent what the government is saying or what they will really do. But the trend right now we're seeing is this entire government reform is huge, and majority of the officials, like the entire department will be moved as a whole. That's what people are expecting. But right now, I mean, they're having a lot of meetings and working plans to do the actual transaction, because not only the climate change department is influenced, like one of the research institute or the key think tanks attached to this, what will happen to them is a huge question, like the NCSC.
NCSC, sure.
So it's not only about the government, but also about the supporting entities that are attached to the government. What will happen? They definitely have expertise. Their expertise is recognized to be the important one, so that's why they are shifting to the MEP. And also, I think, like I just talked to Daifan about the new head of Department of Climate Change called Li Gao. He made a public speech right after the transaction in the China Development Forum, I think 2 weeks ago. And he definitely welcomed this change, and he think they will do China will still honor the entire, not only Paris Agreement commitment, but also the climate change strategy in the long term. So he think it's a good.
Great. Well, thank you. Craig, as I mentioned when introducing you, you've spent a lot of time both in China mapping out these policies and most recently reacting to the launch of the national ETS. What do you see as some of the core challenges China faces in the years to come and some of the questions it really needs to answer in the near term?
Okay. You know, as Jackson said at the beginning, carbon markets are, China's taking a big bet on carbon markets. And part of that big bet is that this is probably the most complex policy instrument one could choose to help in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. They're by far and away, in my opinion, the most complex policy choice one can make. And there's been mixed results across the board with those that have tried before. And China has a history not with greenhouse gas, but with SO2 markets as well, which we can talk about in the discussion that were also mixed. For China, I think one of the major challenges is that these markets are being launched in a larger context of China's political system and economic system. And instead of getting, you know, into the weeds on things like auctions and free allowances and, you know, and third-party verification and all the technical aspects of implementing a market, I think what I'd like to do is ask you to take a step back and think about how this plays out in a system like China, in China's political economy. Now, I've been studying China in a serious way for about 15 years, and it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I was confident enough to put something in writing that was, you know, even mildly critical of their efforts, because right now China's doing, you know, deserves credit for what it's doing, and this is a big risk. So with that in perspective, and with all respect for what they're attempting, I'm going to try to give you some perspective as to where I see the challenges. Now, if I were given one word to describe China's political economy, and if I had to explain it in one word, the word would be subsidies. Okay? Now, go ahead and I have a slide, but I get a slide to explain that. So, you know, before you think too hard about that slide, let me tell you a statistic from a study from the Unirule Institute in Shanghai. China has roughly 130,000 plus state-owned enterprises. Okay? 105 of them at the national level. These are the big national SOEs. But there's also, you know, over 100,000 smaller national and provincial and below. Just the 105 big national SOEs from 2001 to 2010, for one decade, received subsidies that were 7 times their stated profits. Okay, that means that during that period, those 100 plus SOEs were not only not making money, they were losing roughly 7 times in economic terms what their stated profits were. Okay, that's a big figure. That's losing a lot of money. Now, what does this mean from the point of view of carbon markets? Those represent still a very large portion of the Chinese economy. According to the National Statistic Bureau, they're only a third of the economy by employment, but we know that there's reasons to believe it's closer to 2/3, and we don't have time to go into all that. But there's reason to believe it's the state sector is much larger than, in fact, a third still, and still represents closer to what it historically has. Now, the problem is for carbon markets, the point is a strong price signal. And if you've got a blizzard of subsidies, if you've got all of this white noise created by subsidies, it's like driving through a snowstorm, you're not going to be able to see the beacon that you're supposed to go to. The subsidies are going to get in the way because there's competing incentives. Now, there are two other problems with the pervasiveness of subsidies in the Chinese economy. Price signals are information. I mean, you can think of it as price or information from an economics point of view. It's all the same. It's information. And without having clear economic accountability, hard budget constraints, transparency in incentives because of these subsidies, you destroy market information. Now, there's a corollary to this, is that information within the Chinese political system is heavily controlled. And basic information regarding things like inflation, employment, GDP are all considered off limits for the media to report on. Okay? I can give you the citations, but Xinhua has a monopoly on those topics. Xinhua is basically a subsidiary, if you'd like, of the propaganda department, the central government, and so they control information on that. So in 2015, when the Chinese market dipped, lost a third of its value, the way the government reacted was not to step aside and let the market correct. It was to blame foreign forces. They jailed a few journalists. Then they started changing the rules of the game so that it made margin trading easier and pension funds could invest and prop up the market. Okay, not very market oriented. Okay, so you've got an information problem. On top of that, who pays your way is who controls you. Okay, and that's a reality. This creates enormous conflicts of interest throughout the system. And in one of the earlier discussions we had, then the first day, one of the individuals from Mexico, I can't remember, he was from one of the projects, said, it's very important for local communities, strong stakeholder engagement to protect the interests of local communities. Well, that is, I thought, brilliantly true and a simple, clear statement. And the problem with China is what we have is problems with straw men stakeholders, because not only the party, but it's also the subsidies too. So you've got this kind of confluence, a perfect storm of incentives, lack of information, conflicts of interest. No one wants to say, by the way, the kinds of, you won't find much critical of the national ETS. One reason I think for that is people are, we all want to be encouraging of this. And everyone should be given a real fair shot at putting a policy together like this. But at the end of the day, if we're not hard-nosed about these really complex policies, we're not doing China or anyone else any favors here, because we got to get to the right outcomes because we've got time's ticking and we've got about 20 years. So it's in that spirit that I offer this. I'm touching the surface and I know I need to stop, but I was afraid I was going to pull punches. I think I was plenty direct.
I think you are plenty direct. We appreciate that, Craig. I want to add to your snowstorm just a tiny bit, because there's an element here that I think is implicit in a lot of your comments, but that we could address a little bit more directly, which is the kind of milieu of overlapping environmental policy instruments that are in play in China, some of which might have the capacity of being a countervailing force to the effectiveness of the ETS themselves. Now, these can come in forms of subsidies and feed-in tariffs, but they can also come in less apparent forms, even vehicle emission standards, things like that, and certainly, perhaps most importantly, through a number of command and control measures to address domestic air pollution that dovetails with GHG emissions, but that there's an indirectness and a siloed potential policy approach there. So how do you view those in relationship to some of the challenges you've just outlined?
Great point. So if we go back and we look at China's experience with the SO2 markets about 20 years ago, they put up SO2 markets. They were pilot kind of things. We've done assessments of them. I used to be with Renmin University at the School of Environment, and based on the analysis that we did, we don't think they had any impact at all. What did have an impact was command and control. The government just went in and closed small plants, which they're still doing. They're still trying to decapacitate a variety of sectors for economic reasons, not for climate reasons, but it has co-benefits. So, if you're interested in an academic kind of evaluation of what policies work and what contribution they make, these kinds of command and control mechanisms create all kinds of havoc because it's hard to separate out the cause and effects. But if all you care about is getting to the right outcome from a climate perspective, maybe we don't really care, because as long as we're getting the outcome we want. But there's an opportunity that gets missed here, because China can't continue to simply operate based on command and control. It is far too costly for them to do that. If they, when you close a plant, workers don't get paid if they're not an SOE. They're out of work for a period of time. So can't get into that with the time we've got, but just to underline the point, if we're going to go with market-based approaches in China, the cost to these kinds of policy misalignments is we never really get our markets right. Yeah. But I would argue that given the subsidy situation, and if in discussion I can unpack a little bit of that, you'll see, I think, that markets, as we understand them, don't actually exist in China in the way that we regard them as, to allocate resources, to make decisions. In China, it's not quite that way. They don't set prices necessarily, at least not in the wholesale market, and they don't really allocate resources either. The central planning bureaucracy is still quite alive and quite well.
Thanks. There's a Deng Xiaoping maxim, I don't care if the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. But I think that this space is really illustrative of the ways in which that kind of mentality can be problematic when we're looking at this combination of command and control and market mechanisms, not least of all because it undermines the very purpose of having the market itself. Fawn, I want to turn to you to speak in some specifics about the sorts of issues with China's ETS that you're tracking closely from the state of California.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you all for your insights. I guess, well, with your question, I wanted to break it down into my answers into three parts. We've always been faced a question, as the state, we do have a bunch of MOUs with the Chinese national and subnational governments, and the topics of those MOUs cover not only cap and trade, but other range of environmental policy issues and other trade investment issues. A lot of times we were facing this question of people asking, are you really doing anything with the Chinese on those MOUs? What are you doing with the Chinese on the cap and trade? A simple answer here is yes, and I would go into a little bit details of what we have done with China on this specific topic. California, as we all know, our cap and trade program got up and running by the year 2006. We have the AB 32 passed the legislation, and the program itself here is very robust. But we started working with China back in the year of 2013. As Lulu mentioned, when China started its ETS pilots, it was called Emission Trading Scheme pilots with 7 cities and provinces in China. And we started working with 2 of the pilots there. One is called Shenzhen pilots, the other is in Guangdong. Both are very close sister state and city with California. In the past few years, in our work with them, we found some fundamental difference in terms of the program, how we design ours and how they design their program. But we also found quite a few things in common. That is their determination of how they want to really improve their air quality and get their greenhouse gas emission down. In terms of the specifics of the program that we've worked on, and some of those did not quite work out, I would just want to use some examples here that I got from my colleagues from the Air Resource Board. That one of the fundamental difference that we see in terms of the program design and implementation is the data accuracy. We in California spent 6+ years before we actually launched our cap and trade program here. But the Chinese, when they started in 2013, there even wasn't a national greenhouse gas data available. So that was a major and fundamental difference there. But from the pilots we've worked with, Shenzhen and Guangdong, they picked up very fast. They started their greenhouse inventory right after they launched the pilot program, but they picked up very fast. The year was 2015, when we went back to Shenzhen, they were showing us their facilities and how they did their MRV, their monitoring, reporting, and verification. My understanding is that it was quite fast off their learning curve. And the other thing I want to mention here is what we call enforcement of our program here and their enforcement system in China. I think Craig touched a little bit about their national system and subnational and their political economy and all those parameters in affecting their program in China. I think the enforcement part, it was actually one of the most focused topic that every time when we receive Chinese delegations, those officials would always ask us questions about how do you make sure the enforcement of your program? How do you punish whoever doesn't comply with the MRV requirements? And how do you do this in your system? I guess the fundamental difference here, and I think I agree with Craig, is their political economy, their political system, and their legal system is so different from what we have here. So we can't simply just tell them what we do with our program, they can copy that. I think that's why it actually took quite a while for China to really launch its national program as robust as it claimed to be at the beginning. I think these are all very understandable from, a point of view that we are designing a program and we want to make sure that when it's up and running, it's really, would make things work instead of doing things in a rush, covering 8 sectors at once and nothing worked out. The other I wanted to mention here as an example is I think you actually touched a little bit on, is the policy making piece. In China, because in California we have the AB 32, it's very grounded. But in China, there is no climate change law. There's no AB 32 in China before they launched the cap and trade market. So I think that's another fundamental difference. Then here, we already have the AB 32, and cap and trade program was one of a suite of programs California launched to ensure the goals of AB 32 can be met. And that's another fundamental difference. Without a law, without the existing policy there to support their program, it's really, it's different. It doesn't mean it will not work, but I think it's different from what California, what we have here. In terms of our work with them, and also I wanted to really mention our work from the Air Resource Board. A lot of our colleagues actually have been to China. They talk to the Chinese policymakers on cap and trade and other topics on a regular basis. And we do a lot of workshops here, and we go to China, attend their workshops there. I think right now what I got from the Air Resource Board colleagues, that the major topics that they're still working with the Chinese National Development Reform and Commission. That's what Lulu mentioned, the current authority for the cap and trade program. And the key topics that we've been in constant exchange with them include data accuracy, which I've mentioned, MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification. And also, we have been talking about the features of the linked programs California now have with the Quebec and Ontario. I guess the other question I wanted to really raise here is, a lot of times we've been asked the question, would California's program be linked with China eventually? I think it's a very premature question to ask, and it's even more premature for me to answer here whether or not California is going to link with the Chinese market. But I guess just to share, in California, to link, we do have a very strict process here. And the governor would have to look at the proposal if ARB thinks it's necessary and worthwhile after undergoing a set of assessments of the requirements, whether or not a Chinese program is as strict or even more strict than California program, and also making sure timeline-wise, because our program, because of the SB 398 last year, got extended to 2030. And so far, we don't know yet how long the Chinese national program will run through. There's no clear timeline for that national program to be run until. So without a clear timeline, I think it's very premature to consider about linking, but we are actually working with them and trying to help them in terms of the design of the program, implementation of the program, and enforcement of the program. So I think there's some good energy there, and there's good hope and positive aspects of it, but we also have some reservation about the difference of two programs and how that will work out in the future.
Thank you. I want to react to one thing you said and then obnoxiously press you even more on linking, even though you've said that you don't want to go much further than you've gone. So apologies in advance for that. One thing I really appreciate you bringing up is the difficulty of rapid data collection, not just for MRV purposes, but for compliance and allocation determinations. And I just want to emphasize for our audience that this is where a lot of the really harried work is taking place in China for the government authorities. We're looking at ultimately 7,000 to 8,000 entities is often what's quoted. Lulu, correct me if I'm wrong. And a fairly complex benchmarking strategy for determining what those compliance obligations should be. So when we see the winnowing down of sectors that are going to be covered, the more tepid ambition for the timescales at which the national ETS will be rolled out and will be becoming more mature, the sources of those delays and of those constrictions are often these compliance determinations and just the enormous amount of on-the-ground work that has to be done to figure out what they should be. You were really starting to hint at this, I believe, at the end of your comments, Han, but a popular term in China on linkage these days is linkage ready. So we don't want to talk about linking with other markets. We'll hear some of the thought leaders in China say, or the government officials say right now, but we do want to have conversations around the design of our market and the design of our peers' markets that can allow for potential linkage in the future. And that, just as importantly, don't lock out possible linkage opportunities in whatever form they might take, from offsets to allowances to subnational or sector-based linkages, et cetera. Was that part of the conversation with California and China?
Yeah, so according to my colleague's notes I just looked this morning, one of my colleagues in ARB, she went to a workshop, actually was in January in China, to talk about what California does with the cap-and-trade program, and also to hear the Chinese policymakers about their thinkings of how the national program will be implemented in China. And also they brought up the potential linkage topic, but it was like very brief at the workshop, and I got nothing from my colleagues saying, either the Chinese is interested in linking at this moment, or California is interested in consider any linkage topic at this moment.
Sure. Some of the timeframes we're hearing are, exploring linkage in the 2030 sort of range, and for me personally, it's difficult to think about what we'll be doing in 2030. But maybe some of you have greater foresight than I do. I've seen several people in the audience suggest that they might have questions or comments. It's an appropriate time to turn over to that. We have a gentleman in the back, second row.
Thanks for the very direct discussion of what goes on in China. Those of us who work in China know the issue. And the question is, how is the government organizing its effort? Is the classic old, everybody doing a little bit? We know Beijing steel factories moved out of town and things like this. Cap and trade is a vehicle for coordination among industries. Do you see any trends or any different vehicles other than the old combination of consensus back and forth and now stronger command and control the consensus, but how are they managing the issue of pollution reduction, which is probably the second most important thing for the whole, the second most important measure in northern China for the party's legitimacy? The first being the economic progress in general.
Lulu, can you get us started on that?
Okay. The previous Minister of Environmental Protection actually was is the mayor of Beijing right now. So that helped a lot with the air quality improvement of Beijing this year over the winter time. So that also have a trend right now. We can see more of the higher level government officials shifting, and the more collaboration is needed. So I totally agree with you. Like carbon market is a tool that combines all of the policies. Like one difficulty we're facing for, like Fan said, we don't have a management decree or fundamental law of climate change issue because right now so many ministries is involved. The People's Bank, Ministry of NDRC, Ministry of Environmental Protection, Ministry of the Science Technology, and the state-owned enterprises like the SACs. So we, with all of the party involved, so the process of legislation is definitely slowed down. But with the transaction to the MEE, we do believe this entire integration of policy between climate change and environment, especially air quality improvement, will integrate it. Like for example, right now, China's doing this permitting system, which include all of the other air pollution than CO2, although there's a long conversation about CO2, whether that's air pollution or not. But with the transaction, it indeed opened the door for the MEE to include CO2 as one of the permitting air, or the permitted air pollution, which kind of a workaround to help the government without passing a management decree of ETS, which costs like 3 years and without really publish anything. It is a possibility for the new MEE to move things forward.
Craig?
Short follow-on, just a short clarification question.
Yeah.
Which ministry is holding the database of those pollutants? Is anyone?
Which database? It's different. Like
or some semblance of a database of which factors are polluting where? Has the Ministry of the Environment been allowed to do that?
Ministry of Environment holds the database of conventional pollutions, and for CO2, the database right now there are some sort of the database right now, but they're actually building a better database as one of the 4 supporting systems that will, right now it's under NCSC, but with the change, we don't know whether NCSC will exist. And for others, for example, CEC, China Electricity Council, have the best electricity-related data. So that's production, not only production data, but also the fuel consumption data. So this data are directly related to how much emission you emit. So a lot of data are hosted by the industry associations who are actually was the government. For example, the chemistry associations was the Ministry of Chemistry before.
Just for everyone's benefit, the NCSC is the official NDRC linked government think tank in China. So yeah, there we go. Certainly. Craig or Fan, do you want to react to this issue at all?
I wanted to add, based on what Lulu mentioned, I guess I don't know if it's helpful for you to understand. My understanding of who manages the data system collecting and reporting in China is whenever those comes to air pollutants, like SO2 and those, the Ministry of Environment manage and regulates it. When it comes to the greenhouse gas, the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, has its Climate Change Bureau, and its affiliate entity like NCSC, the National Climate Strategy Center, regulates it. So I think that's my understanding of how they divide the CO2 part and other air pollutants. But in California, we have ARB here that have a more robust and holistic approach of the air pollutants, and especially in terms of the co-benefits.
Well, I would just add to that. I think that you've really provided the perfect encapsulation of why the MEE is being created. It's to address the very issues that can arise from that kind of bifurcated approach to regulating emissions. And in addition to these sorts of things taking place traditionally in separate tracks, you have different enforcement mechanisms that are available in the past, the MEP versus the NDRC. So it's very early days of this consolidation, but it's certainly something to watch for those of us in this space. Other questions or comments?
Jackson, can I just?
Oh, yes, excuse me,
Just wanted to comment on one thing. It's important to note that that database is not being made public. So the data is, well, it's not normal in a trading environment because you can't really trade without information. And so, hopefully when this gets all transferred over to the Ministry of Environment, that'll break it open and we'll get that data. But the problem is that the government is treating this as proprietary trade secrets of these enterprises, which again goes to the conflicts of interest inherent in a state-dominated system. And they're thinking about trying to dribble that information out selectively to academic and think tank organizations, but that creates a problem of selective disclosure, which in a trading market can create insider trading opportunities. So when we're talking about a market that's going to be 3 times the size of the EU trading market with billions of dollars being traded and people being paid, roughly $10,000 to $12,000 a year in salary in academic organizations working on this data, it's going to be awfully tempting to try to use that data. There will be violations, and you can't really do trading in that kind of a situation. The only other thing I wanted to just briefly add is if you're thinking about policy, there's this license, this permitting policy that MEP developed is really important, as Xiaolu pointed out, because that was kind of the Trojan horse that MEP put out there to take carbon trading within a broader permit, a single permit for all emissions. But you also need to think about the decapacitation policy of reducing excess capacity in industries that are carbon intensive like coal and steel. That's an economic policy that's going to remain with NDRC. That is not up for, I think, debate within the government as to who controls that. And that is really the driving force right now, I believe, in the Chinese economy that will drive emissions reductions as well as pollution reductions.
And that highlights the continued need for coordination, which is something that the vice minister that's taking the helm of the MEE has been quite explicit about, that we're going to have a larger ministry. It's going to take a more holistic approach to Chinese environmental policymaking. And yet, because this is such a large issue with tendrils that go in so many different directions, coordination with entities outside of our ministry, including the NDRC, which is mentioned explicitly, is going to be essential. So it's a really important point. Okay, next question or comment. Yes, sir.
Thank you. This question is very premature, but I'd be curious, very interested to know, in terms of offsets, if you have any sense or have heard anything in terms of what type of offsets, should they be allowed, might be considered into the market, for instance, the methane sectors, small-scale hydro, et cetera. Thank you.
Do you know much about that?
I can talk a little bit about that, but as I just talk about the timeline, so the offset is only considering the third phase. So for the first 2 phases, there's absolutely no offset. And also, like, I don't know whether you're familiar with CCER, because all of the offset in China has to be registered at the CCER, which, yeah, China carbon emission reduction. So the CCER have several categories. Some of the categories are even pre-CDM categories. So it's definitely something trouble. So that's why the government is a little bit hesitate to include all of the offset right now. As far as I know, hydro, things like that is definitely out of consideration. There's several discussion about this, like the government trying to include, they call it high quality offsets. Majority of them, like there's no definition of high quality offset right now, but for some of the pilots, they are identified like forestry, agriculture, things like that. And also more of a recent offset, like there's discussions like after 2015 probably, because you cannot really buy offset. Like our carbon market, there's no spot trading right now. So even in 2018, there's no spot trading. So there are no intention to buy any offset like 5 years ago.
Since you say you asked a question that's a bit early in the game to ask, I'll give an even earlier potential extremely speculative scenario for offset usage that is being discussed at a completely academic level right now in China. But that's a JCM, a joint crediting mechanism type system, similar to what occurs in Japan, in which you have an MOU between a recipient country where investment from China into that recipient country that yields some mitigation value and benefit can then be divided between that country and China in the form of offsets. This is certainly not anything codified in the government plans. It's not related to what Lulu just explained about the CCER equation, but it is something that's being discussed. And I think as China's investment in its near abroad continues to expand under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, there could be more potential to gain some offset yields from those activities. Any other comments or questions from the floor? We have a bit of time. Yes, here in the front.
Alden Meyer, Union of Concerned Scientists. I wonder what you can say about China's position in the international negotiations around the Article 6 mechanisms related to the development of the domestic trading market. Is China pushing for flexibility? Are they pushing for project-based crediting to sort of continue the CDM model into the future? I mean, how is the evolution of the market in China driving their negotiating positions?
Wow, I have to say, like, although in the China's Paris Agreement working plan, they do set about something about the carbon market, but there's still no direct linkage. For example, like how many, like what percentage of China's commitment will achieve through carbon market, and also like I've only I'm not part of the negotiation team. I only participate in some workshops, totally academic. And what they are doing is quite open. They're discussing all of the possibilities. Like the researchers are participating. They're waiting for, because right now nobody knows what Article 6 will become. So I haven't heard any strong position from them yet. So they're exploring different discussions.
Greg? Alden, in the last version of the climate map that I sent you earlier, we have a section where we went through a year and a half worth of China's submissions. This was when they were doing the discussions around the early discussions immediately after Paris, and we go through each of the main topics. And my recollection may be wrong, is that they are basically opposed to a sectoral approach and still in favor of project-based approaches, which we have understood, although we're interpreting that it might be based on sovereignty concerns and not necessarily wanting to, again, there's a protectiveness about information within China, and I'm sure that there's a competitive industry competitiveness analysis that's done as a corollary to that. But if you look at that document, it does have all the, we're going to update that where we're tracking China's negotiating positions.
I've asked this question as well because I'm also curious about the answer to some Chinese officials, including those on the negotiating team. My sense, to put it crudely, is that Article 6 is deprioritized at the moment in favor of a real strong focus on domestic ETS architecture building and development. And that could certainly change in the future, but it's not gaining a lot of policy prioritization at the moment. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Lizzie.
Apologies if this has already been discussed, but how is the cap and trade going to intersect with the pilot provinces that have the energy allowance trading and the other initiatives going on, even the REC market, and there was a once white certificate market that is no longer in existence. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how those will intersect and overlap.
We've discussed policy overlap broadly, but not those specific topics. So thanks a lot for bringing them up. Lulu or Craig or Fan, do you have any comment?
I do not know the answer to that.
From pilots, it's right now it's still very unclear whether what is the transaction between pilots and the national carbon market. Like there's concern raised about that. So the government right now, because for the first two phases, there's still no concern because the pilots will run as a pilot. For example, the Shenzhen, they have like almost 1,000 enterprises, but all of them are small scales. They don't have any heavy industry, so only like a handful of companies will be included into the national market. So for a lot of pilots, they'll still run as normal, and it's also up to the pilot to decide whether they want to run. About policy integration, it's indeed hard to tell because each policy is run by different government. Even like for some of policy are controlled by NDRC, but they are from different departments. So there's definitely this competition between different policies. So we do believe carbon market is a way to reduce carbon emission cost effectively, especially compared with what Greg said about CO2. So we do hope in this race, carbon market or the market mechanism will win.
I'm glad Lulu uses the word competition. I think it's a really important one here. The ETS is already kind of one competition for the heart of future climate policy in China with advocates for a carbon tax coming out of the Ministry of Finance. And the ETS, at least in this moment where we sit in this room, has largely won the day on that for the foreseeable future. But you rightly bring up these other instruments, green certificate schemes, et cetera, that, as we discussed previously, can have complementarity in some cases, but also come in tension with the market in others. And there's certainly no design element that will keep that from happening. So it's something that will continue, I think, to be a challenge for the market designers and operators in China moving ahead. If there are no other questions, I want to give our speakers the chance to give some concluding thoughts. We could sneak in one small question if anyone has a burning thought or idea. If not, I think we'll go in reverse order. And Fan, just if you could give us one thing to really look at or pay attention to on the Chinese market between now and 2020.
Thanks. I think I would actually, if I were in a position to offer any advice, I would suggest the Chinese policymakers to actually take a step back, think about the policy contribution or greenhouse gas emission reduction contribution from its cap and trade program, how big of a contribution that will be in the absence of a 2020, 2030, and 2050 national greenhouse gas emission goal. I think that would be my advice to them to think about. And then in terms of the implementation and enforcement, I would also encourage the policymaker to take a step back to think about, without robust data to support their decision, to decide how big the cap will be and what is going to be the decreasing rate of the cap and in which sectors. To think about, without such data basis, how do you make sure that decision making could lead to actual greenhouse gas emission reduction instead of basically a well-functioning market?
One quick note on the cap, and then one really tiny quick follow-up question in our final 4 minutes. So one thing to keep in mind on the cap is that China's working from efficiency targets. These are tradable performance standards that are the kind of basis for the market itself rather than an absolute cap. And there is real soul searching, I think, in China as to whether this will lead to an absolute cap or whether we will continue to have these tradable performance standards into the future illimitably. And my question is, you rightly point out the value, I think, of trying to ascertain how the ETS will affect emissions reductions for the next 20 years, 30 years, 4 years, how that will dovetail or not with China's NDCs. But given all that we are talking about and hearing about these policy overlaps and various different instruments, how do you think it's easy or difficult or possible or impossible to make that determination? It seems like a very difficult research question for me. Like, what is actually causing the emissions reduction? Is it the ETS? Is it something else? Is it some combination? How do we go about looking into this?
Yeah, I guess, Jackson, we can spend like a whole day discuss this, but this generally aligns with what we are trying to discuss and encourage the Chinese counterpart to do is in September, while the governor will convene the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco. We're also inviting Chinese policymakers to come here, but not just come here to listen to what we're doing. Instead, we want to encourage them to bring their commitment. For example, their commitment on this cap-and-trade program, their commitment on the national mid-century strategy of how China is going to figure out its pathway to its whatever goal they would have, either it's a carbon intensity goal or it's a greenhouse gas emission reduction goal by 2050. Because we think these are the actual pieces will be driving the policy forward. So that's what we're trying to do. I don't think that will answer your question, but without an answer, that's what we are trying to convene the Chinese policymaker to really think what we are thinking here and to align on policy goals for future collaboration.
Thanks a lot. That's wonderful. Craig, you've, in part because we've asked you to, outline several of the challenges China faces. Can you leave us with one potential solution, some kind of promising trend or decision that could be taken that could help address at least some or an aspect of what you've described?
So the writing that I'm doing on this is focusing on transparency. And I think in the context of carbon markets, there would be two aspects to that I think are most urgent, but they're not the only ones. One is, again, this data issue, not only providing the data, but telling us how it is obtained, how it's checked, how it's verified. Again, from being at a Chinese university, the conventional or the traditional pollutants are reported publicly, but we could not obtain any information as to the methodology for how they are actually measured. Just doesn't exist, not in the public, not in anything published. And being at People's University of China, Renmin University, we're a state institution, national institution. We should be able to get that. It just doesn't, it's simply not available. So go a few levels down as well. Don't just assume that the data is being reported is right. You got to know, you've got to make that data foot to a methodology as well as be checkable, be verifiable. The other aspect, I think, of transparency that I would be immediately concerned with, and this is true whether it's an academic setting or you're in the market, is these offset standards and the credibility of the environmental impact that they claim to have, because again, that's going to be a supply issue for the market, as well as if you're concerned not about profiting but about the environmental result. We need to make sure that those are truly what I guess the term is additional. But I would like to avoid using that term because it's itself difficult in any context. But for China, the standard setting has become a bit of a cottage industry now, and that's a topic we don't have time to get into, but really drilling down on the standards that are being adopted and then how they're implemented. And that's tough to follow in China because, when you start going down from the national level and the announcement level, and you look at how things are actually implemented, unless you can follow a verifier around and actually see what they're doing, and you've got spot checks and a system in place, you can't do that. But that needs to be done, and how that's going to be done is going to be really challenging. So I would say transparency, and I've got 2 items on my list of priorities that I've got questions about. But then when you get past those, there will be others, because these markets are complex.
Lulu, things are moving really quickly in China, and at the same time with the ETS, there's been a certain element of delay as we've moved on in the launch and the operationalization. What do you think are the government's top priorities over the next 12 months?
Can you define government?
Sure, MEE.
Okay.
and on the ETS, excuse me.
Okay.
What are China's top ETS priorities for the year to come?
For the year to come, especially after the reform, is the education of the MEE staff. Because right now, only the climate change department understand. Inside MEE, they understand well about climate change issues, but not the others, like the permitting stuff. They need to understand carbon, not only carbon trading, and also like the methodologies, MRV, how do you calculate the data, what is the data quality, how they can be implemented or included in the permitting system. The on the ground, like almost 10,000 people on the ground who collect the data, who do the enforce, they need to understand this. So the capacity building actually is the key right now.
Thank you, and thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers.